The diamond ring on my finger was a fake, a $30 piece of glass I'd bought at a flea market to match the story I'd told Mark about my struggling upbringing. But the look of pure predatory calculation in his mother's eyes when she saw it was disturbingly real. I had come to this remote, ivy-choked estate expecting a test of my character, but within an hour of crossing the threshold, I realized I wasn't the one doing the testing. I was the prey being sized up for a slaughter I hadn't seen coming. What Mark didn't know, and what his family couldn't possibly guess, was that while I was playing the part of the penniless girl from a dying village, the very shoes I'd hidden in my trunk cost more than the rusted gate at the end of their driveway. And the company I'd built from scratch was currently negotiating the buyout of the bank that held their family's massive hidden debts. My life, until that weekend, had been a carefully constructed sanctuary of quietude. I am Elena, and for 3 years I had been the secret success story of the tech world. I'd grown up in a house where the wallpaper peeled like sunburned skin, and dinner was often whatever was on sale at the corner kiosk. So when my software company took off, I didn't buy a Ferrari or a penthouse. I bought security. I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, drove a 5-year-old sedan, and kept my name out of the headlines. I wanted to be loved for the girl who liked old books and burnt toast, not for the balance in my investment portfolio. Then came Mark. We met at a public library on a rainy Tuesday. He was an architect, or so he said, with a penchant for sketching old cathedrals and a smile that seemed to promise a lifetime of stability. He was gentle, or at least he performed gentleness with the skill of a seasoned actor. He would bring me wildflowers he'd picked on the side of the road, and we'd spend hours talking about a future built on nothing but our shared dreams. When he proposed 6 months later, kneeling on a patch of grass in the park, I felt a surge of guilt for the lie I was living. I wanted to tell him then. I wanted to say, "Mark, we don't have to worry about the mortgage. I can buy us a palace." But a small, wounded part of me, the girl who had been burned by a gold-digging ex in college, held me back. I told myself I'd tell him after I met his family. I wanted to see where he came from, to see the roots that produced such a seemingly grounded man. "My mother is traditional, Elena," Mark had warned me during the 3-hour drive to his family's ancestral home. He reached over, squeezing my hand, his palm slightly sweaty against mine. "The Von Berneys were once a very powerful family. They've lost some of that luster, but the pride remains. Don't be offended if she's a bit cold. She values lineage and hard work. Just tell her about your village, about your parents' little farm. She'll appreciate the purity of it." I had nodded, smoothing down the skirts of a faded cotton dress I'd found at a thrift store specifically for this occasion. I'd even left my expensive skincare at home, opting for a cheap drugstore moisturizer that made my face feel tight and itchy. I wanted to be the blank canvas they expected. The estate, Blackwood Manor, was a crumbling monument to a vanished era. It sat at the end of a long, potholed drive, its gray stone walls covered in thick, strangling vines. It smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. As we pulled up, the front door creaked open, and a woman stepped out who looked as though she had been carved from the very stone of the house. This was Evelyn. She was dressed in a high-necked black blouse, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her forehead. "So," she said, her voice like gravel shifting underfoot, not even waiting for us to reach the porch. "This is the little village girl Mark couldn't stop talking about." She didn't offer a hug or even a handshake. Her eyes swept over me, landing on my diamond ring with a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify at the time. Not disappointment, but a sharp, clinical interest. "Welcome to Blackwood, Elena," she said, though the word welcome felt like a threat. "I hope you aren't allergic to dust. We've had to let the cleaning staff go. Hard times fall on everyone, even those of us with history." The interior of the house was a cavern of faded opulence. Persian rugs worn thin by decades of footsteps, oil paintings of stern-faced men in military uniforms, and the heavy, suffocating scent of old wax and stale air. Mark seemed different here. The relaxed, confident man I knew in the city had vanished, replaced by a hovering, nervous shadow. He wouldn't look me in the eye, his gaze constantly darting toward his mother, seeking approval in every breath he took. "We've prepared the attic guest room for you," Evelyn said, leading the way up a grand staircase that groaned under our weight. "Mark will be in his usual quarters. We are a traditional house, as I'm sure your parents taught you in the country. No shared beds before the vows are exchanged." "Of course, Mrs. Von Bern," I murmured, playing the role of the submissive, intimidated fiancé. "It's a beautiful home, so much history." She paused at the top of the stairs, turning to look at me. The light from a stained glass window cast a bloody red hue across her face. "History is all we have left, my dear, and history is expensive to maintain. Mark tells me you're a hard worker, that you've saved up a little nest egg from your clerical work. He mentioned you were quite the frugal girl." I felt a slight chill. Mark and I had discussed my savings, but I'd only ever mentioned a modest amount, enough for a down payment on a small condo, I'd told him. Why was he discussing my finances with his mother before I'd even stepped foot in the house? "I try to be careful with my money," I replied cautiously. "When you grow up with nothing, you learn to value every cent." Evelyn smiled then, and for the first time I saw her teeth. It wasn't a warm expression, it was the smile of a cat watching a mouse run into a corner. "Exactly. That's exactly what we need, a girl who knows the value of a cent, and who knows how to keep her mouth shut when the family business requires it." She left me in the attic room, a cold, drafty space with a single iron bed and a window that looked out over a stagnant pond. As the door clicked shut, I sat on the edge of the bed, the cheap fabric of my dress itching against my skin. Something was wrong. The air in this house felt heavy with secrets, and for the first time, I wondered if the simple life I'd been seeking with Mark was just another layer of a much larger, much darker deception. I reached into my bag and pulled out my second phone, the encrypted one I used for business. I had no signal. I was cut off, a simple girl trapped in a house of ghosts, and the man I loved was downstairs, whispering in the dark with a woman who looked at me like I was a ledger to be balanced. The next morning, the house felt even colder, the dampness of the surrounding woods seemingly seeping through the very stones of the walls. I woke up with a stiff neck from the lumpy mattress and went downstairs, my footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the hallway. I found Mark and his mother in the dining room, sitting at a long, scarred oak table that could have seated 20. There was no grand breakfast, just a plate of stale-looking toast and a pot of tea that smelled faintly of copper. "Did you sleep well, Elena?" Mark asked, but he didn't look up from his cup. He looked haggard, his eyes underlined with gray shadows. "The room is a bit drafty, but I managed," I said, trying to catch his gaze. "Mark, are you okay? You look like you haven't slept at all." "Just family business," Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharp as a razor. She was meticulously spreading a thin layer of margarine on a piece of toast, her movements precise and mechanical. "The burdens of an old name, my dear, something you wouldn't understand, coming from a village where life is simple. Here, every brick demands a price." She looked at me then, her pale eyes boring into mine. "Mark tells me your parents' farm was lost to the bank. Is that right? A tragic story of debt and dispossession." I felt a prickle of unease. I had told Mark a version of that story, a half-truth about my childhood struggles, but the way Evelyn said it made it sound like she was checking a box on a list. "It was a long time ago," I said softly. "We moved on." "And yet, you've managed to save quite a bit for a girl in your position," Evelyn continued, ignoring my discomfort. "Mark mentioned a figure. 70,000? Or was it 80? Quite impressive for a secretary." I looked at Mark, expecting him to jump in, to apologize for sharing my private financial details, or at least to look embarrassed. Instead, he just stared at the tea leaves in the bottom of his cup. "I might have mentioned it in passing, Elena," he muttered. "Mom was just worried about our future. She wants to make sure we're prepared." "Prepared for what exactly?" I asked, my voice tightening. "For the restoration of this house," Evelyn snapped, slamming her knife down. The sound rang through the room like a gunshot. Blackwood is the soul of this family. It is our legacy, and it is currently being suffocated by taxes and repairs. Mark has a responsibility to this name, and as his wife, so will you. The conversation felt like a trap closing in. Throughout the day, the warning signs began to pile up like dead leaves. I saw a man in a dark suit arrive at the back door, not a guest, but someone delivering a thick envelope that Evelyn snatched away before I could see the return address. I overheard Mark arguing with his sister Lydia, a woman I hadn't even met yet, in the library. "She's a peasant, Mark. How much could she possibly have?" Lydia's voice hissed through the heavy wood of the door. "She's smarter than she looks." Mark's voice was a low, desperate growl. "And she's careful. If we push too hard, she'll bolt. Mom says we need to wait for the signature." "We don't have time to wait for a wedding. The creditors are at the gate." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. My peasant status was clearly a talking point, but there was a disconnect. If they thought I was a poor girl with a meager savings account, why were they so desperate for my signature? $80,000 wouldn't even fix the roof of this monstrosity, let alone satisfy major creditors. The breaking point came that evening. Mark had gone out with his mother to settle some local matters, leaving me alone in the house. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't sit in that attic room any longer, playing the role of the blushing bride-to-be. I needed answers. I made my way to the library, the scene of the earlier argument. The room was a mess of leather-bound books and dust, dominated by a massive mahogany desk. I felt like a thief in my own life as I began to leaf through the papers left on the blotter. Most were utility bills, final notices printed in glaring red ink. But then, tucked inside a leather ledger, I found a manila folder with my name on it, Elena Vance. My hands began to shake as I opened it. Inside wasn't a collection of my village stories. It was a comprehensive, professional background check. There were printouts of my social media, my high school records, and then the air left my lungs. A detailed financial dossier. There was a copy of my company's tax filings from the previous year, a list of my private investment accounts, a grainy photo of me walking into my corporate headquarters in the city, wearing a $3,000 suit I only wore for board meetings. They knew. They had known from the very beginning. Mark hadn't met me by accident at the library. He had hunted me. But it was the last document that turned my blood to ice. It was a draft of a prenuptial agreement, but not one meant to protect his assets. It was a predatory contract that, once signed, would merge my corporate holdings with a family trust controlled entirely by Evelyn von Bern. Underneath it was a power of attorney form, already filled out with my name, needing only my signature to give Mark full control over my bank accounts in the event of emotional incapacity. The room began to spin. A wave of nausea rolled over me, so strong I had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. My pulse thundered in my ears, a deafening, rhythmic drumbeat that drowned out the sound of the wind outside. The gentle architect I loved was a fiction, a mask worn by a man who was helping his mother dismantle my life for the sake of a crumbling pile of stones. The world seemed to slow down, every detail of the room becoming agonizingly sharp. I saw the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, the fraying edges of the rug, the cold, calculating greed reflected in the very ink on the page. I wasn't just a bride. I was an insurance policy. I was a bailout. I heard the heavy front door groan open, the sound of footsteps, Mark's familiar stride and the sharp click of Evelyn's heels echoed in the foyer. "Elena?" Mark's voice called out, sounding practiced and warm. "Sweetheart, where are you? We brought back some wine to celebrate." I looked down at the folder in my trembling hands. My first instinct was to run, to scream, to throw the truth in his face, but as the nausea receded, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity, I realized that if I ran now, they would just find another way to trap me. I closed the folder, tucked it back into the ledger exactly as I'd found it, and took a deep, shuddering breath. My heart was still racing, but the heat of the shock was freezing over into something much more dangerous. They wanted the simple village girl? Fine, I would give her to them. But the CEO they had researched was about to show them exactly how she'd earned her first million, by never letting the enemy see the blade until it was already at their throat. I walked out of the library with a mask of perfect composure, my heart a cold stone in my chest. They were waiting for me in the dining room, the flickering candlelight throwing long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. A bottle of expensive Bordeaux stood open on the table, a jarring contrast to the margarine and stale toast image they'd projected earlier. "There she is," Mark said, his voice a pitch too high. He stood up, pulling out a chair for me with a flourish that felt choreographed. "We thought we'd lost you in the depths of the house. To family? And to our future?" He held up a glass. I sat down, my eyes fixed on the dark red liquid. It looked like blood. "To the truth," I said softly, my voice steady, "in all its forms." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she didn't miss a beat. She took a sip of her wine, her movements elegant and predatory. "The truth is a luxury, Elena, one that people like us, and people like you, often have to dress up to make it presentable. Wouldn't you agree?" "I suppose so," I replied, "like pretending to be an architect when you're actually just a man who spends his days managing his mother's dwindling expectations, or pretending to be a simple girl from a village when you're actually the majority shareholder of a firm that could buy this estate and turn it into a parking lot by Monday morning." The silence that followed was absolute. Mark's glass hit the table with a dull thud, wine splashing onto the white cloth like a fresh wound. The mask of the gentle lover didn't just slip, it shattered, revealing a frantic, cornered animal underneath. "Elena, I can explain," he stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Explain the dossier in the library, Mark, or the private investigator's fees listed in your mother's ledger." I leaned forward, the flickering light catching the fake diamond on my finger. "You didn't meet me by accident. You hunted me. You staged that meet-cute at the library because you knew I liked old books and quiet men. Every word out of your mouth for the last 6 months has been a scripted line." Evelyn didn't look shocked. Instead, she leaned back, a chilling smile touching her lips. She reached into her silk handbag and pulled out a stack of documents, the same ones I'd seen in the library, along with a few new additions. "Let's stop the theatrics, shall we?" she said, her voice dropping into a low, menacing purr. "Yes, we know who you are. We've known since the second month Mark started seeing you. You thought you were so clever, playing the simple girl, but you were just making it easier for us. A girl with no family, no connections, and a massive fortune. You're a miracle, Elena, a godsend for a family with our overhead." "You're insane," I whispered. "You think I'm just going to give you my company because you asked nicely?" "Not because we asked," Evelyn corrected, sliding a document across the table. It was the power of attorney form I'd seen earlier, but there was a new page attached. "Because you've already started the process. Mark, show her." Mark wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, his voice barely a murmur. I had to, Elena. The creditors were going to take the house. They were going to put Mom in the street. I used the digital signature you used for our travel insurance last month. I've already transferred the first consultation fee from your personal account to the Blackwood Trust." The ground didn't just fall away, it evaporated. My own fiancé had stolen my identity to rob me before we were even married. "How much?" I choked out, my hands beginning to tremble despite my efforts to stay calm. "2 million, Evelyn said casually. "A drop in the bucket for someone of your stature, I'm sure. But here's the beauty of it, dear. If you go to the police, the investigation will reveal that you've been living under a false persona, lying about your origins, and engaging in what looks like a very complex shell game with your own assets. We've made sure the trail looks murky. You'll be tied up in litigation for years. Your board of directors will move to replace you the moment the word fraud is whispered in the press. You'd destroy my life for a house?" I looked at Mark, pleading for some spark of the man I thought I knew. "Mark, look at me. You said you loved me. You said you wanted a life with me." Mark finally looked up, and what I saw in his eyes was worse than hatred. It was nothing, a hollow, spineless vacuum. He didn't speak. He just looked at his mother, waiting for his next instruction. He was paralyzed, a puppet whose strings were being pulled so tight he couldn't even breathe for himself. "He does love you, in his way," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "He loves the security you provide. And you will provide it, Elena. You're going to sign the rest of these papers. You're going to marry Mark, and you're going to quietly funnel your earnings into this estate. In exchange, you get to keep your reputation. You get to keep your simple life. We might even let you keep that charming little apartment in the city for your business trips." "And if I refuse?" Evelyn's face hardened, the mask of the aristocrat replaced by something truly monstrous. "Then we reveal the truth our way. We have recordings, Elena, conversations you had about your poor parents, your struggling upbringing. We'll paint you as a corporate spy, a pathological liar who manipulated a vulnerable old family to gain access to their social standing. By the time I'm done with the press, you won't be able to get a job as a cashier, let alone run a tech giant." The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. I looked at the papers, then at the man who had promised to grow old with me, and then at the woman who was trying to swallow my life whole. "You think you've won," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I know I have," Evelyn replied. "Now, pick up the pen. Let's not make this more unpleasant than it already is." I reached for the pen, my fingers brushing against the cold gold of the barrel. But as I did, I felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't the fear of a victim anymore. It was the cold, calculating rage of the woman who had built an empire from a one-room apartment while eating ramen. They thought I was a girl who had stumbled into money. They forgot that I was the one who had created the technology they were now trying to use against me. "One more thing," I said, pausing with the pen over the signature line. "How did you get my private tax records? Those aren't public, not even for a high-end investigator." Evelyn smiled, a look of pure triumph. "Oh, Elena, you really should be more careful with who you trust in your own office. Sarah is a very ambitious woman. She realized long ago that a CEO who is distracted by a husband and a demanding mother-in-law is a CEO who can be easily guided. Sarah, my CFO, my best friend since college, my bridesmaid-to-be. The betrayal was complete. It was total. I was surrounded by vipers, and they had been feast on my life while I was busy looking for wildflowers. I looked at the signature line, my heart slowing down to a steady, lethal rhythm. The simple girl was dead, and the woman who replaced her was about to show them that while they were playing at being royalty, she had been learning how to be a god. I looked down at the paper, the ink of my signature still wet. Evelyn reached for it with a tremor of greed in her fingers, but I didn't let go. I held the edge of the document, my eyes locking onto hers. In that moment, the fear that had been suffocating me simply evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline silence. They thought they had found my weakness, but all they had done was reveal their own. They were hungry, desperate, and short-sighted. And I? I was the woman who had built an empire out of thin air. "You know, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing the soft village girl lilt I'd been maintaining. "There's a reason I never use my real name on the front lines of my business. It's not just for privacy. It's because I like to see who people are when they think no one is watching. And you? You are exactly what I suspected, a parasite clinging to a dead name." Mark flinched. Evelyn's smile faltered, her grip on the paper tightening. "Sign it, Elena. Stop talking and sign the power of attorney." "Oh, I already did," I said, flicking the paper toward her. "But I didn't sign my name. I signed a kill code." Confusion flashed across her face, but it was quickly replaced by the sound of a chime from my pocket. I pulled out my encrypted phone, the one I'd told them had no signal. It was glowing. "When I entered that specific string of characters into that document," I explained, my voice as sharp as a scalpel, "it triggered a localized alert to my security firm. They've been tracking this phone's GPS since we crossed the county line, but more importantly, It activated a honeypot protocol on the accounts Mark just robbed. You see, Mark, that $2 million wasn't in my operating capital. It was in a dormant account specifically designed to flag unauthorized transfers to the federal authorities. By the time the sun comes up, every penny you moved will be traced back to the Blackwood Trust. It's not a gift, it's a felony. Mark's face went from gray to a ghostly, translucent white. Elena, wait! And as for Sarah, I continued, standing up and smoothing my thrift store dress, I felt more powerful in that faded cotton than I ever had in silk. She's currently being escorted out of my headquarters by 3 detectives. You see, I've known Sarah was skimming for 6 months. I was just waiting to see who she was working for. I never expected it to be my own fiancé. But then again, life is full of surprises. You're bluffing, Evelyn hissed, though her hand was shaking so violently the paper rattled. You're a little girl from a farm. You don't have this kind of power. I own the bank that holds the mortgage on this house, Evelyn, I said, leaning over the table until our noses almost touched. The smell of her expensive, stale perfume was nauseating. I bought your debt 3 weeks ago under a holding company. I wanted to surprise Mark after the wedding. I wanted to tell him that his family's legacy was safe, that he didn't have to carry the weight of this crumbling mausoleum anymore. I was going to give you a fresh start. But now I think I'll just let the foreclosure proceed. You have 48 hours to pack. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of gravel crunching outside. Heavy doors slammed. Blue and red lights began to pulse against the library's dusty windows, casting a rhythmic, flickering glow over the room. That would be the authorities, I said, picking up my handbag. The unauthorized transfer of $2 million across state lines is a federal offense, and I believe the phrase conspiracy to commit fraud will be mentioned quite frequently in your near future. Mark finally found his voice. He lunged toward me, his face twisted in a mask of desperation. Elena, please, I did it for us. I did it so we could have a future. I love you. I stopped him with a single look. A look of such pure, frozen contempt that he actually stepped back. You didn't love me, Mark. You loved the idea of a girl who was too simple to see through you. You didn't even have the courage to be a villain. You were just a coward who let his mother hold the leash. Don't ever say my name again. I walked out of Blackwood Manor without looking back. I stood on the porch as the officers moved past me, their heavy boots thumping on the rotting wood. I watched as they led Mark out in handcuffs, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in the posture of a man who had never truly stood on his own. Evelyn followed, screaming about her lineage and her rights, until the car door silenced her. The air outside was crisp and smelled of rain. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last 3 years, the weight of my own lies and my own need to be loved for myself, fall away. 6 months later, I sat on the porch of a small, modern cottage I'd built on the edge of the very village I'd told Mark I was from. It wasn't a manor, and it wasn't a peasant's hut. It was a home, filled with light, high-speed fiber optics, and the quiet peace of a life lived in the sun. The Blackwood estate had been sold at auction. I'd heard they were turning it into a boutique hotel, though I doubted they'd ever get the smell of greed out of the walls. Sarah was serving time for corporate embezzlement, and Mark was somewhere in a state penitentiary, likely still waiting for his mother to tell him what to do next. I picked up a book, the fake diamond ring long since tossed into the stagnant pond behind the manor. My hand was bare, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel the need to hide what I was or what I had. I had set out to find a man who would love a simple girl, but in the end, I found something much more valuable. I found the woman who was strong enough to stand alone. Some people think that being betrayed is the end of your story, but they're wrong. For me, it was the opening credits. I learned that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a person with a secret. It's a person who has absolutely nothing left to hide.